It's funny how life has a way of wearing things down. Old wood, fences, even hearts. Elias Hartley knows this better than most. A single father doing his best to hold together what little he has left. He's no stranger to broken things. So, when a quiet woman asks him to repair an old shed tucked away on her family's forgotten farm, he doesn't think twice. But what he doesn't see, at least not right away, is that sometimes the things we're fixing aren't just buildings. Sometimes it's people, sometimes it's ourselves, and maybe, just maybe, that woman's shed isn't the only thing ready for a second chance. If you believe, like I do, that even the smallest acts of kindness can change the course of a life, if you find comfort in stories about healing, home and hope, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I promise there are plenty more stories waiting here, just like this one. Now, let's step quietly into Oak Ridge, where everything begins. The morning sun barely crested the ridge when Elias Hartley stepped out onto his creaking porch, coffee in hand, and Maggie clinging to his side like a shadow. The air in Oak Ridge still held the crisp bite of early spring, laced with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Elias took a slow breath, savoring it, that fleeting moment before the day's work bore down on his shoulders. "Daddy, is today a work day?" Maggie asked, her small hand tugging at his flannel sleeve. Elias gave her a weary smile, brushing her tangled hair away from her eyes. "Every day's a work day, kiddo." At 37, Elias looked older than his years, weathered by grief and hard labor. His eyes, a soft gray blue, carried the weight of sleepless nights and unpaid bills. Since Evelyn passed 2 years ago, life had become a careful balancing act. Raising Maggie alone, fixing whatever broken thing the townsfolk needed fixed, and praying each month that the math added up. This morning, it didn't. He glanced at the ledger on the kitchen table. Overdue rent, grocery receipts, Maggie's outgrown shoes circled in red ink. His carpentry business was honest work, but honesty didn't pay quickly. He needed something more, something now. Just as he took another sip, the crunch of tires on gravel drew his attention. A cream-colored truck pulled into his driveway, unfamiliar, clean, and out of place among the rusted pickups of Oak Ridge. Maggie peered up at him, wide-eyed. "Are we getting visitors?" "Looks like it." The door swung open, and a woman stepped out, tall, wrapped in a weathered trench coat, a wide-brimmed hat shading her face. Elias noted the worn boots and the slight hesitation in her step, as if unsure she'd arrived at the right place. "Mr. Hartley?" Her voice was calm, low, with the trace of something refined beneath it, like someone who'd once belonged to a different world. "That's me," Elias replied, setting down his coffee. "Can I help you?" She approached, offering a gloved hand. "I'm Rowena Callahan. I recently moved into the old Greystone farmstead on the outskirts of town." Elias arched an eyebrow. That place had sat abandoned for years, half swallowed by overgrowth. Rumor was it belonged to the Callahan family. The same Callahans who owned half the state's real estate, if he remembered right. But what was one of them doing here alone, in Oak Ridge? Rowena's eyes met his, striking green steady. And for a moment, Elias saw past the guarded exterior to something else. Exhaustion, perhaps, or sorrow she wasn't ready to name. "I need some help," she said after a pause. "There's an old shed on the property. It's falling apart. I want to restore it, not tear it down, rebuild it like it was." Elias folded his arms, curiosity piqued. Most folks had just burned the thing down and start over. Not most folks. The corner of Elias's mouth twitched. He liked her bluntness. "I don't have much in the way of references," she continued, "but the local feed store said you're the best at what you do, that you care about the work." Elias couldn't argue with that. He cared, sometimes too much. Every board, every nail told a story. And stories, especially old ones, deserved respect. Maggie tugged his hand. "Daddy?" Are we going to fix her shed?" He glanced down at her, then back at Rowena. The woman didn't smile exactly, but something in her face softened at the sight of the child, a flicker of warmth behind the cool exterior. Elias nodded. "I'll come take a look." By mid-afternoon, Elias was standing in front of what could barely be called a shed, more like a skeleton of one. Weather-beaten boards clung to rusted nails. The roof sagged under the weight of moss and time. But beneath the decay, Elias saw potential. Rowena stood a few feet behind him, hands clasped tightly, watching his every move. Her silence was heavy, not awkward, but deliberate, like she weighed each word before releasing it. "You plan to store tools in here?" Elias asked, inspecting a cracked beam. "No," she said softly. "I want to make it a place for remembrance, for peace." He turned, curious. "Like a garden shed." "More like a memory shed," she replied, then hesitated. "It was my mother's. She loved this place. I want to honor that." Elias understood loss. He understood the need to hold on to something tangible when the person was gone. He looked around again. The old windows half shattered, the door hanging from one hinge. This shed had seen better days, but it had soul. And that mattered. "I can do it," he said finally. "Won't be easy, but it can be done." Rowena nodded, relief flickering in her eyes. Whatever it takes. As Elias set to work measuring and noting supplies, Maggie wandered through the tall grass nearby, picking wildflowers. Rowena watched her, a wistfulness creeping into her. "Gaze. She's a bright one," Rowena murmured. "She's my whole world," Elias replied without looking up. For a moment the wind whispered through the trees, and all three stood in quiet understanding. A father, a daughter, and a woman with secrets, standing among the ruins of the past, on the cusp of something new. Elias didn't know who Rowena truly was, nor what this shed meant to her beyond the words she'd offered. But he did know this. The work mattered, and sometimes restoring what's broken, in wood or in people, was the most important thing a man could do. The rhythmic creak of the old gate broke the morning stillness as Elias Hartley eased his truck into the gravel driveway of Greystone Farmstead. The air smelled of fresh rain and damp cedar, a crispness that carried the promise of spring, but also the reminder of how much work lay ahead. Elias stepped out, toolbox in hand, and scanned the expanse of overgrown fields. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, its white paint chipped and weathered, much like the woman who now stood beside the leaning shed he'd agreed to restore. Rowena Callahan was already there, arms folded tightly across her chest, her eyes fixed not on him, but on the sagging structure as if it held a secret she couldn't quite unlock. "Morning," Elias greeted simply, nodding as he approached. Rowena glanced at him, offering a brief smile, not out of politeness, but acknowledgement. She struck him as someone who spoke little, but noticed everything. "I brought what I'll need to start the frame assessment," Elias added, kneeling beside the foundation to inspect the crumbling wood. Rowena nodded, stepping back to give him space. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were Elias's tape measure snapping back and the occasional rustle of the breeze through brittle grass. It wasn't until Maggie's voice chimed behind them that the quiet broke. "Daddy, can I help?" Elias turned, startled, to see his daughter already trotting up the path, a basket swinging from her arm, her cheeks flushed from the walk. He had told her to stay back at the house with their neighbor for the morning, but stubbornness ran deep in the Hartley line. Before he could object, Rowena crouched to Maggie's level, eyeing the basket. "What's that you've got there?" Rowena asked gently. Maggie grinned, pulling out 2 wrapped sandwiches and a small jar of strawberry preserves. "I thought maybe Daddy and you might need lunch." Rowena's expression softened, her eyes briefly glancing at Elias. "Thank you, Maggie. That's very thoughtful." Elias cleared his throat, scratching at the back of his neck. "Guess I've got an extra pair of hands now." Maggie beamed and plopped herself beside her father, eagerly watching as he measured each board, running, his fingers along the grain like reading Braille. Rowena lingered nearby, occasionally stepping closer to examine the tools, but never interfering. She seemed content to observe, yet Elias couldn't shake the feeling that she was measuring more than just the progress of the shed. Midway through the afternoon, as Elias pried away a particularly stubborn rotted plank, something clattered loose and landed near his boot. He picked it up, a small rusted tin box, barely the size of his palm. Rowena noticed and knelt beside him, brushing the dust off her jeans. "What's that?" she asked quietly. Elias wiped dirt from the lid and carefully pried it open. Inside lay a collection of faded trinkets, a dried flower pressed between yellowed paper, an old key, and several folded scraps of stationery, edges curled with age. Maggie peered over his shoulder. "Treasure." Rowena reached for one of the papers, unfolding it delicately. Her breath caught. "It's my mother's handwriting," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She traced the looping cursive with trembling fingers, eyes scanning the faded ink. Elias watched as something shifted in her posture, a crack in the poised exterior, something raw surfacing. He had learned, in the years since Evelyn died, to recognize the way grief settled quietly in the bones, the way it resurfaced when least expected. Rowena quickly folded the paper back and slipped it into her coat pocket. "Looks like this shed's hiding more than broken boards," Elias said gently, hoping to offer her a way back from the vulnerability she hadn't intended to show. Rowena stood, dusting her hands off. "Seems so." She didn't elaborate, and Elias didn't press. Everyone carried their own ghosts. By late afternoon, the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the clearing. The skeletal remains of the shed stood a little straighter now. A few supports, reinforced, debris cleared. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Elias packed up his tools, Rowena lingered by the doorway, staring out over the field where Maggie chased a butterfly through tall grass. "She's a good kid," Rowena said suddenly. Elias looked up, surprised by the unsolicited comment. "Yeah? Stronger than she knows." Rowena nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "I wasn't sure about hiring anyone at first. This place, it's complicated." He met her gaze, quiet but steady. "Things worth saving usually are." For a moment, their eyes held, and Elias sensed an unspoken understanding flicker between them. Not quite trust, but maybe the start of it. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, breaking the moment softly. Rowena nodded once. "Same time." As Elias loaded Maggie into the truck and glanced back at the shed, he realized something strange. He hadn't felt this kind of stillness, this subtle pull towards something meaningful in a long time. The shed might have been falling apart when he arrived, but as he drove away, he wondered if, piece by piece, it wasn't the only thing being put back together. The next few mornings followed a quiet rhythm. Elias arrived early, Maggie usually tagging along, and Rowena was always already there, waiting by the shed with a cup of coffee in hand, sleeves rolled up as if she intended to lift the beams. Herself, there was something almost meditative about the work. The days stretched long, filled with the scrape of sandpaper, the knock of hammers, and the occasional low murmur of conversation. The shed, once sagging and skeletal, was beginning to find its shape again, beam by beam, nail by nail. Elias worked steadily, but his mind kept circling back to that little rusted tin box they'd found. Rowena hadn't mentioned it again, but he caught her more than once slipping away into the house with one of those folded papers in hand. Her expression, unreadable. It wasn't any of his business, he reminded himself. Yet he couldn't deny that whatever lingered inside those notes seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders. Late one afternoon, As the sun turned everything a rich honey gold, Elias climbed into the attic space of the shed to inspect the roof beams. Dust motes swirled thick in the narrow slats of light, filtering through cracks in the wood. He adjusted his footing carefully. The boards beneath him felt brittle, one bad step from crumbling. As he ran his hand along the upper joist, his fingers caught on something wedged between two beams. Curious, he pried it loose. A thin, leather-bound notebook wrapped tightly with twine, coated in years of dust. He glanced down, catching Rowena standing below, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Miss Callahan," he called softly, lowering the notebook toward her. She stepped closer, shielding her eyes against the sunlight as she reached up for it. When her fingers brushed the cover, she stilled. "This was my mother's," she murmured, voice catching. Elias watched her thumb over the worn leather, almost reverently. The notebook had likely been hidden away for decades, forgotten until now. Rowena swallowed, then glanced up. "Do you mind if I—" "Take your time," Elias replied, stepping back to give her space. Maggie, who'd been playing nearby, wandered over, sensing something important was unfolding. She stood silently beside Rowena, eyes wide, as Rowena carefully untied the twine and opened the first page. For a moment, only the sounds of the breeze and distant birdsong filled the air. Rowena's lips moved as she skimmed the pages, eyes darting. Quickly, emotions flickering across her face, too fast for Elias to decipher. Finally, she let out a breath and closed the notebook gently. "My mother kept journals," she explained, voice low but steady. "I thought I'd read them all, but I guess she kept some parts tucked away." Elias didn't press her to explain further. He knew enough about grief and memory to recognize when a person was sifting through something too delicate to name. Rowena shifted, her gaze fixed on the shed as if seeing it differently now. "She spent hours out here when I was a kid. I never understood why. I always thought it was just a place to store tools." "Sometimes," Elias said quietly, "the places people retreat to aren't about the tools at all." She looked at him, a faint, tired smile curving her lips. "I'm beginning to realize that." The conversation might have ended there, but Maggie, blunt as only children can be, piped up, "Is your mom like my mom? Gone, but still leaving little treasures behind?" Rowena glanced down, startled, then crouched to Maggie's level. "Maybe she is," she murmured, "and maybe we both have a lot to find." Maggie seemed satisfied with that, reaching up to tug at Rowena's sleeve. "Daddy says fixing broken things makes people feel better." Rowena glanced at Elias, something unspoken passing between them. She straightened, brushing dust off her hands. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "I suppose we have a lot of fixing to do." The following day, clouds gathered thick over Oak Ridge. The scent of rain lingered in the air, dampening the fields. Elias arrived earlier than usual, knowing the weather might halt their progress. Inside the shed, he worked methodically, strengthening the foundation beams. The air felt heavier today, the quiet punctuated only by occasional distant rumbles of thunder. Rowena appeared not long after, this time carrying a small tin box under her arm. She hesitated at the doorway, then stepped inside. "I found something last night," she said softly, holding out the box. "Thought you might want to see." Elias set down his hammer and wiped his hands. Curiosity piqued. Inside the box were more letters, dozens of them, neatly tied with ribbon, yellowed at the edges. Some were addressed, some not. All bore the same elegant handwriting. She wrote them to herself, Rowena murmured almost to herself. Reflections, regrets, hopes, some about this farm, some about me. She glanced up, her expression vulnerable in a way Elias hadn't seen before. "I spent so long running from this place," she admitted, "running from who my family wanted me to be. But these letters, they make me wonder if maybe she was running too, hiding here." Elias nodded slowly, letting the weight of her words settle. Sometimes we don't see what our parents leave behind until we're ready to, he said, voice gentle. Rowena's eyes glistened briefly, but she blinked it away, setting the tin box carefully on a nearby shelf. I want to finish this shed, she said firmly, her tone resolute now, not just for her, for myself. Outside, thunder cracked, and rain began to patter softly against the tin roof. The shed, old and battered, seemed to hum quietly beneath it all, as if the walls themselves recognized the turning point. Elias smiled faintly, picking up his hammer once more. Then let's keep going, he said. The rain passed by morning, leaving the fields damp and glistening, steam rising faintly as the sun fought its way through thinning clouds. Elias arrived at Greystone Farmstead early, knowing days like this, soft ground, cool air, were good for solid work. No oppressive heat, no distractions, just the rhythm of his hands, the creak of old boards, and the satisfaction of watching something broken begin to mend. Rowena was already there, perched on the porch steps with a notebook open across her knees. She glanced up as Elias approached, her face softer, but her eyes far away. "Morning," he called, wiping rainwater from his brow. She nodded, closing the notebook gently before standing. "You're early." "Storm kept me up," he replied. "Figured I'd put the restless energy to use." He moved toward the shed, already eyeing where they'd left off, a section of warped siding that needed replacing. Rowena followed, but today there was a tension in her movements, something brittle beneath the calm. She stood beside him as he gathered his tools, but her hands stayed shoved deep in her coat pockets. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally, breaking the silence. Elias glanced up, surprised by the directness. "Sure." Rowena hesitated, then looked straight at him. "Why did you take this job? You didn't ask for much pay. Most folks wouldn't waste time on something like this. A shed no one's cared about in decades." Elias paused, setting his hammer down, wiping his hands on his jeans. He thought about it for a moment before answering. "I guess," he began slowly, "some things are worth fixing, even if no one else sees the value. Doesn't matter how small. You put your hands to something broken, you start to see yourself differently too." He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Besides, not much in this world lasts, but if I can help hold one thing together, even for a little while, that feels like something." Rowena held his gaze, something unreadable flickering behind her eyes. "You ever feel like it's easier to fix wood than people?" she asked quietly. Elias chuckled under his breath. "Every damn day." For a heartbeat they stood there, the air thick with something unspoken. Then Rowena let out a breath and shifted back toward the shed. "Can you show me how to replace that siding?" she asked, voice lighter. He nodded, passing her a pry bar. "Sure, just watch your fingers." They worked side by side for hours, peeling back warped planks, measuring, cutting. Maggie appeared after school, sitting cross-legged in the grass nearby, humming to herself as she braided wildflowers. Occasionally, she'd glance up, her bright eyes tracking the easy rhythm that had developed between her father and Rowena. By mid-afternoon, Rowena's hair had slipped from its usual neat braid, strands clinging to her temple, dirt smudged across her cheek. She wiped her hands and leaned against one of the sturdier beams, catching her breath. "I haven't done anything like this in years," she admitted. Elias glanced at her. "You're not bad at it." She huffed a soft laugh. "I grew up in boardrooms, not barns." That was the first time she'd offered something about her past without being asked, and Elias didn't miss the shift. He didn't press, just handed her a bottle of water and let the silence settle comfortably. Finally, Rowena spoke again, quieter this time. "My family, they had plans for me. The Callahan name means real estate, money, expansion. There wasn't much room for choices or mistakes." Elias nodded, waiting. "When I walked away," she continued, eyes fixed on the shed's